Okay, so let's unpack this. Ivan Pavlov. You hear that name, and I mean, instantly a bell rings.
Literally.
Literally, a bell rings, or maybe a metronome ticks, and you just get this image of a dog drooling on cue.
Right. It's almost a caricature. He's probably the single most famous scientist who's been reduced entirely to one single pop culture experiment.
It's the ultimate reductionist trap. The general understanding of Pavlov is just stuck somewhere between a cartoon of a salivating dog and maybe a page in a Psych 101 textbook.
It really is. But when you actually dive into the sources, I mean, the historical record of his career, you find this profound, almost unbelievable duality in his professional life.
A duality that starts with him being a master physiologist first, operating Tsarist, and then early Soviet Russia. And what stands out immediately, and this is the insight we really want to drill into for you today,
Yeah.
is that his Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
It had absolutely nothing to do with bells or dogs or conditioning.
Not a thing. He won it for completely transforming our surgical understanding of the digestive system.
And that's our mission for this deep dive, moving beyond the conditional reflex to the revolutionary scientist behind it all.
We're going to explore the vast, kind of complex career of a man who was, first and foremost, a surgical genius and a pioneer in physiological methodology.
We're diving into his whole journey from this strict religious seminary background all the way to becoming the first Russian Nobel laureate.
And we'll focus on the specific, really complex details of his surgical innovations and his surprisingly turbulent political life under the Soviet state, where he was somehow both a favored son and a very open critic.
And here's where it gets really interesting for me. That meticulous nature, that absolute drive for scientific purity in just measuring things, that is precisely what led him to his most famous, yet completely unplanned discovery in psychology. He was actually trying to eliminate a variable, and instead, he just discovered a whole new field of study.
An incredible story.
So let's start at the very beginning, in Ryazan, Russia, because his formative years, they gave absolutely no indication he would end up changing the whole landscape of scientific psychology and medicine.
So when we look at his birth year, 1849, you have to picture the heart of Tsarist Russia. It's a society deeply rooted in tradition and, of course, the Orthodox Church.
Right.
And Ivan Petrovich Pavlov was the first of 10 children born to a Russian Orthodox priest, Peter Dmitrievich Pavlov.
10 children.
10. And his wife, Varvara Ivanovna Uspenskaya, was, a diligent homemaker. You can just imagine the atmosphere of a large religious household.
A lot of structure, a lot of faith.
Exactly. Young Ivan willingly participated in house duties, things like gardening, doing the dishes, caring for his younger siblings. It was just a life of structure.
It sounds like the kind of traditional pious upbringing that's designed to produce the next generation of clergy, which, makes his eventual pivot to radical science all the more dramatic.
It does. And his early life was also marked by a pretty serious setback that delayed his trajectory.
Yeah, he was able to read by 7, but he didn't actually start formal schooling until he was 11 years old.
And that delay was because of a really consequential childhood injury. He fell from a high wall onto a stone pavement and sustained some very serious injuries.
Wow.
It required a long recovery time, and it kind of illustrates the fragility of life and, the limitations of medicine back in the 19th century.
You have to wonder if that experience subconsciously planted the seeds of a deep interest in how the body works, how it recovers.
It's very possible. So he initially attended the Ryazan church school and then the local theological seminary, which was strictly the expected path for a priest's son.
But the scientific and progressive seeds were already being planted through literature and intellectual exchange.
Yes. This is where he encounters the ideas that completely rerouted his entire life, a real intellectual rupture.
He was inspired by the progressive materialist philosophy of this literary critic, Dmitry Pisarev.
Pisarev was critical for that whole generation of Russian intellectuals. His ideas promoted radical social reform and, really importantly for Pavlov, a skeptical approach to traditional dogma.
Emphasizing science and observation as the only path to truth.
Exactly. That gave Pavlov the intellectual rationale he needed to abandon his religious training.
And then there was his scientific hero, the physiologist Ivan Pavlov.
Ah, yes. A man Pavlov would later revere. He even called him the father of Russian physiology.
So what was Sekhanov's big idea?
Sekhanov's work was all about reflexology. He proposed that even complex psychological phenomena could be explained through physiological reflexes, particularly those that start in the brain.
Okay, so for Pavlov, who's already leaning toward empirical truth because of Pisarev, Sekhanov provides the perfect scientific framework.
The perfect one. The belief that the nervous system was the key to unlocking all of organic life.
So in 1870, at 21 years old, he makes this monumental shift. He just abandons his religious career without even graduating from the seminary.
And devotes his life entirely to natural science, enrolling in the physics and mathematics department at the University of St. Petersburg.
That must have taken immense personal courage. I mean, given his family's position as clergy.
It absolutely did. And his motivation wasn't really career ambition in the way we think of it. It was this inherent driving force. He called it the instinct for research. He wasn't pursuing wealth or status. He was just pursuing knowledge.
And he didn't waste any time. We see immediate success in his research track while he's still an undergraduate.
That's right. In his 4th year, he won a prestigious university award for his research on the physiology of the nerves of the pancreas.
That's a huge early validation, like a sign saying you're on the right path.
It really was. And it gave him the momentum he needed to dive into medicine proper. After he got his degree of Candidate of Natural Sciences in 1875, he went on to the Imperial Academy of Medical Surgery.
And he spent 2 intensive years just investigating the circulatory system for his medical dissertation, so his interests were already firmly rooted in the body's involuntary systems.
He was also attracting powerful mentors. He worked with Elias von Sion and later the renowned clinician Professor Sergei Botkin.
Botkin was clearly impressed by Pavlov's rigor. He invited him to be the chief of the physiological laboratory at his clinic.
That whole trajectory led him to graduate from the Medical Military Academy in 1879, winning a gold medal for his research. And the culmination of this early period came in 1883 with his doctor's thesis.
On the centrifugal nerves of the heart.
Yes, and that thesis was foundational because it introduced one of his most important early theoretical contributions.
Okay, so let's pause on that contribution. The basic principles of the trophic function of the nervous system. That's a term we need to define clearly because it really sets the stage for everything he did later with digestion and, well, conditioning.
Absolutely. So the nervous system had long been understood to govern movement and immediate reflexes, what we might call action commands.
Right, like pulling your hand away from a hot stove.
Exactly. But the trophic function is much subtler. The word trophic comes from the Greek word trophos, which means feeder or nourisher.
So how did Pavlov define it? What was he proposing?
He was proposing that the nervous system had a regulatory function that went way beyond immediate reaction. It actually influenced the fundamental health, the growth, the nutrition, and the structure of organs and tissues.
So think of the nervous system not just as the accelerator and the brake,
but as the engine maintenance light, the oil pressure gauge, and the fuel mixture control all rolled into one. It's constantly regulating the internal metabolic state of the tissue itself.
That significantly changes how we view the nervous system's role. It's not just about signal transmission anymore.
No, it's about long-term biological maintenance.
So how did proving this change the scientific conversation at the time?
Well, it suggested that nervous disorders could have profound systemic effects on the body's actual structure and health, not just its immediate movement or feeling. And his collaboration with the Botkin Clinic during this period, it provided solid empirical evidence for a basic pattern in how reflexes regulate the circulatory organs.
So he was mapping the entire involuntary system with this incredible precision, and that set the stage for his major breakthrough. So his foundational work on the autonomic system, it demanded exposure to the best European techniques.
It did. From 1884 to 1886, he studied in Germany. He was in Leipzig with Carl Ludwig, who was a giant in physiology, and then in Breslau with Rudolf Heidenhain.
And Heidenhain was already studying digestion using an exteriorized section of the stomach.
That European apprenticeship was absolutely critical. It showed Pavlov the cutting edge of surgical physiology, but also, and this is key, the methodological limitations of the existing techniques.
Heidenhain's method was good, but it was flawed.
It was flawed because the isolated stomach section, it behaved abnormally. And Pavlov, with his background in the trophic nerve function, he realized why it behaved abnormally.
And here's where it gets really fascinating, the part that actually won him the Nobel.
Yeah.
The surgical innovation that gave rise to the Pavlov pouch. You mentioned the organ behaved abnormally after Heidenhain surgery. What was the massive technical challenge that Pavlov overcame?
The challenge was maintaining the physiological normalcy of the subject, specifically the structural and functional integrity of the stomach tissue being studied.
Okay.
When Heidenhain isolated a section of the stomach to collect pure digestive secretions, The surgery often meant severing the vagus nerve supply to that isolated pouch.
So the pouch was no longer under the control of the central nervous system.
Precisely. And because the central nervous system, via that vagus nerve, controls the rate and the composition of gastric juices, severing that connection meant any results you gathered from the pouch were physiologically unreliable.
It was a failure to account for that trophic function he was so interested in.
Exactly. Pavlov perfected the exteriorization technique by overcoming this problem. He engineered a specific surgical procedure that created what's now called the Pavlov pouch, an isolated, smaller stomach section, while meticulously maintaining the external nerve supply.
Especially branches of the vagus nerve.
Especially the vagus nerve. And this allowed him to study the digestive process under far more natural, regulated conditions.
That just sounds like genius-level surgical mastery. How difficult was it mechanically to perform that procedure without causing nerve damage or infection?
Oh, it was incredibly difficult. The vagus nerve is a very delicate structure, and the surgery required separating a small portion of the stomach lining while preserving all the vascular and, most critically, the nervous connections.
It must have required a long recovery for the animals.
Days, weeks, sometimes even months of recovery, which illustrates Pavlov's dedication to long-term care and observation. This technical feat was really the foundation for his entire reputation.
And that surgical skill allowed for a monumental shift in scientific methodology, the shift to chronic experimentation.
Yes.
I understand previous experiments were acute, meaning they involved vivisection, which resulted in the death of the animal during the procedure.
That's a key distinction, and it reflects Pavlov's commitment to real-world physiology. Acute experiments could only observe immediate reactions or post-mortem structure. You were essentially studying a system in shock, not a system functioning normally.
But Pavlov insisted on chronic experiments. These long-term studies where the canines were not only kept alive, but were kept healthy, treated well, and observed repeatedly.
Yes, his lab actually housed a full-scale kennel for the experimental canines, not just a surgical theater. He saw these animals as research partners, not disposable specimens.
Because he recognized that only a healthy, relaxed animal could provide valid data on normal digestive function.
Absolutely. This approach dramatically improved the scientific validity and, it offered a moral counterpoint to the prevailing, often brutal vivisection methods of the time.
That makes perfect sense. If you are studying how a system works when you are healthy and eating a meal, you can't study that on an animal that is actively dying on the table.
Exactly. And his team was so meticulous in how they conducted these long-term studies. They surgically implanted fistulas, these permanent openings between organs and external pouches, to examine contents and secretions.
And sometimes they went even further.
Oh, yeah.
The legendary sham feeding mechanism. Can you explain that specific detail?
The sham feeding procedure was just pure methodological brilliance. So, to study the pure secretion of gastric juices that was prompted by just the sight or smell of food.
Without the food actually getting into the stomach.
Correct. Without the complications of the food physically entering the main stomach, they would surgically create a separate opening in the esophagus, diverting the chewed food outside the body.
Wait. So the dog would eat, it would enjoy the flavor, chew the meat.
Everything.
But the food would never actually enter the stomach.
Correct. The chewing, the tasting, the swallowing, it all provided the immediate nervous signals to the stomach, the psychic phase of digestion, without the mechanical or chemical stimulation of food touching the stomach lining.
Which allowed Pavlov to isolate the pure nervous control of the digestive glands.
And prove definitively that the vagus nerve played the primary role in initiating digestion, based purely on external cues like sight and anticipation.
12 years of this kind of meticulous research, the Pavlov pouch, chronic studies, sham feeding it all, culminated in his major publication, The Work of the Digestive Glands, in 1897.
And after 4 successive nominations for the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, he finally won in 1904.
That recognition was immense. It made him the first Russian Nobel laureate.
Yes, and the Nobel Committee was very specific. They said the award was in recognition of his work on the physiology of digestion, through which knowledge on vital aspects of the subject has been transformed and enlarged.
He proved that digestion was a finely coordinated reflex arc regulated by the nervous system, not just some localized chemical process. He literally transformed the field.
The genius of guts, indeed. He transformed medical research by making the animal subject an ongoing, dynamic laboratory rather than a one-time specimen, all based on a profound understanding of nerve function. Now, here's where the world shifted. All of this dedication to pure, long-term physiological observation, these chronic experiments, is what led, almost by accident, to his most famous contribution to psychology.
The happy accident. It occurred because he was trying to measure physiological reactions so precisely. He's trying to eliminate variables, but he encountered a whole new, uncontrollable variable.
Right.
What did he observe that was so unexpected?
He observed what he called psychic secretions. During the measurements of saliva and gastric juices, he saw that the dogs began to produce the digestive fluids before the food was even presented.
So they weren't reacting to the food itself.
Not yet. They began salivating the moment they saw the laboratory technician who routinely fed them, or even when they just heard his approaching footsteps.
So the organism was anticipating the food based on an external cue that had no inherent link to nutrition. This contamination of his pure physiological data must have been initially frustrating for such a rigorous scientist.
Well, yeah, it was. But Pavlov was too dedicated to that instinct for research to just ignore the phenomenon. He realized he had stumbled upon a fundamental law of learning.
So he shifted his focus.
He quickly shifted to systematically study how these external cues triggered involuntary physiological responses. And this led him to develop the concept of the conditional reflex.
Later known in English as the conditioned reflex, or classical conditioning.
Exactly. And he did this jointly with his assistant, Ivan Pavlov, around 1901.
The core idea, which I think we all know in abstract, is that if a neutral stimulus, like a sound, is consistently presented just before the food, the unconditioned stimulus, the organism will eventually associate the two.
And produce the involuntary physiological response to the sound alone.
Right. The sound becomes the conditional stimulus. The food is the unconditional stimulus.
And the salivation becomes the conditional response when it's prompted by just the sound. This showed that higher brain centers could reorganize the reflex pathways that governed involuntary functions like digestion. It was huge.
And Pavlov was actually the first to communicate the initial results, right?
He was. He called the phenomenon a reflex at a distance at the Congress of Natural Sciences in Helsinki in 1903.
But there's a fascinating wrinkle in the history here about precedence. We often credit Pavlov alone, but there was parallel work happening simultaneously in the U.S.
This brings up an important question of timing and, publication impact. Edwin B. Twittmeyer in Philadelphia published similar research in 1902.
A year before Pavlov published his full theoretical explanation.
A full year before, Twittmeyer demonstrated the conditioning of the knee-jerk reflex in humans.
So if Twittmeyer published first, why does Pavlov get all the credit for establishing classical conditioning as this cornerstone of psychology?
It largely boils down to the scope and the theoretical framework. Twittmeyer's work was localized. He demonstrated a conditioned reflex in a specific instance, and it was presented during a PhD dissertation defense. It just didn't get wide scientific dissemination at the time.
Whereas Pavlov was a Nobel laureate who immediately connected this accidental insight to his massive existing framework of nervous system activity.
Exactly. He didn't just notice a dog drooling. He formulated a comprehensive theory of how the brain creates these systematic temporary connections,
which he fully explained at the 14th International Medical Congress in Madrid in 1903 in a paper titled The Experimental Psychology and Psychopathology of Animals.
Right. He established the broad principles: acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, all the fundamental mechanisms that govern associative learning. His comprehensive physiological approach gave the finding a weight and an intellectual momentum that Twittmeyer's more isolated observation just didn't have at the time.
And yet the single most famous image associated with him, the bell, is highly debated. Did Pavlov always use a bell?
The popular belief is just so firmly entrenched. Pavlov's bell. It's concise, it's memorable, but the scholarly consensus is that the bell is basically a cultural shorthand.
A myth.
A powerful myth. His research records detail the use of an extensive variety of stimuli to create that association.
Okay, so what are some of the other conditional stimuli his team used?
Oh, we have detailed records of his team using electric shocks, whistles, metronomes. The rhythmic ticking was a favorite of his tuning forks to produce very precise tones, and various visual stimuli like flashing lights or the rotation of objects.
The goal was to test the limits of the nervous system's capacity to form associations.
Exactly, under varying levels of intensity.
So the man who won a Nobel for surgical genius probably didn't even use the bell he's famous for.
The irony is just profound. A. Charles Catania, among others, cast serious doubt in 1994 on whether Pavlov ever actually used a bell in his primary experiments.
So where did the image come from?
Scholars like Lippmann suggested the popular imagery was codified and popularized in the West by his contemporaries, specifically Vladimir Mikhailovich Bekhterev and, crucially, John B. Watson, who adopted Pavlovian ideas wholesale.
It just highlights how a complex scientific finding can get compressed and, sometimes distorted by cultural retelling to the point that the symbol completely replaces the substance.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, Pavlov never really saw himself as having abandoned physiology for psychology.
No.
He viewed conditioning not as the end goal, but as an incredibly sensitive tool to map the ultimate physiological mechanism, the nervous system itself.
He was always looking for objective, measurable biomarkers for temperament types, which were originally described thousands of years ago by Hippocrates and Galen.
Exactly. He wanted a rigorous biological basis for personality in a way. He wanted to move it out of the realm of philosophy or humorism and into hard science.
And he called these essential distinctions the properties of nervous systems.
Precisely. His work in the conditioning lab showed him that while all dogs could be conditioned, they all responded wildly differently. Some learned fast and resisted forgetting, others were highly reactive, and some were slow and steady.
And he identified three core properties he believed governed an organism's reaction to stimuli and its overall temperament.
Right. The first was strength of the nervous process. This relates to the maximum intensity of stimulation the system can handle before it just breaks down.
Okay.
The second was mobility of nervous processes, how quickly the system can transition between states of excitation and inhibition, basically how adaptable it is.
And the third?
A balance between excitation and inhibition. Excitation is the drive to react. Inhibition is the capacity to stop or suppress a reaction.
So he essentially updated the classical four temperaments using these rigorous scientific biomarkers. That's a huge intellectual achievement.
It is. He's finding a physiological foundation for ancient philosophical concepts.
So how did he map them?
He derived 4 temperament types based on how those 3 properties interacted. He correlated them to the classical names but gave them a scientific definition.
Okay, so number 1.
The strong and impetuous type, which he correlated to the choleric. They have strong nervous processes, but often a poor balance, leading to rapid, sometimes explosive reactions.
Number 2.
The strong, equilibrated, and quiet type, which is the phlegmatic. They possess strong, stable processes that are well-balanced, but low in mobility. So they're steady and calm, but slow to change habits.
Right. And 3.
The strong, equilibrated, and lively type, or the sanguine. Strong, balanced, and highly mobile processes, making them energetic, adaptable, and quick to respond.
And finally, number 4.
The weak type, correlated with the melancholic. This is characterized by a nervous system with low strength. Their system just struggles to cope with strong stimulation and quickly shifts to protective inhibition.
That concept of the weak type brings us directly to another fascinating area of his research, transmarginal inhibition, or TMI. You mentioned that it's a biological defense mechanism against overwhelming stress.
It is, and it's a concept that has immense modern relevance. Pavlov and his researchers studied TMI, the body's natural response of just shutting down when it's exposed to stress, pain, or stimulation that exceeds its capacity.
So in the lab, this might have been observed when a dog conditioned to, say, a really loud sound suddenly stopped responding.
Or even fell asleep. It's like a circuit breaker in the nervous system. The stress or stimulation gets too high, and rather than overloading, the system just flips a switch to protect itself.
That's a perfect analogy.
The system reaches a critical threshold, and instead of reacting more intensely, which is excitation, it effectively forces self-inhibition to protect the delicate cortical cells from damage.
And Pavlov noted that the most basic inherited difference across temperaments was how soon they reached this shutdown point.
Exactly. The weak type, or melancholic temperament, for instance, reaches that critical threshold much, much faster.
It's a profound realization that stress tolerance is, at least in part, physiologically determined.
It is.
But let's look at his official legacy. His principles were crucial for the developing field of comparative psychology and provided the groundwork for behaviorism, popularized by John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner.
Oh, he is undeniably foundational. A 2002 survey ranked Pavlov as the 24th most cited psychologist of the 20th century, which is remarkable considering his primary field was medicine.
His insistence on objective measurement and controlling the environment became the methodological bedrock for the entire behaviorist movement.
Even though he disagreed with their rejection of internal states.
And his work didn't stay locked in theory. His principles are central to modern behavior therapy. For you, the listener, who might be interested in application, where do we see his ideas at work today, beyond just treating phobias?
Well, systematic desensitization for phobias is the classic example. If you have a fear of flying, a therapist uses conditioning to gradually pair the feared stimulus, thought of a plane, with a relaxed state. They're essentially retraining the fear response.
But let's bring this application right into daily life, maybe in education.
You're talking about antecedent control strategies in the classroom. And it's a direct lineage from Pavlov's method, which showed that the cue, the antecedent, dictates the response.
So what does that look like in practice?
Antecedent control involves manipulating the conditions before the behavior to make the desired behavior more likely, or the undesired behavior less likely.
Let's have a concrete example. Say a teacher constantly struggles to get their class to quiet down and start working after lunch.
Instead of constantly yelling or reacting after the disruptive behavior starts, which is a consequence strategy, antecedent control uses a conditional stimulus preventatively.
Oh.
For instance, the teacher might consistently play a specific, calming piece of classical music, the conditional stimulus, every single day, only for the 2 minutes immediately before quiet work time.
Over time, that specific music becomes conditioned to the state of quiet focus.
The music, the antecedent, now cues the appropriate behavior. The research is compelling. Antecedent-based interventions, rooted directly in classical conditioning, are empirically supported for producing immediate reductions in problem behaviors in a classroom environment.
Pavlov showed us that the environment is often the cue for the response, not just the consequence.
Yeah.
So, stepping back into his biography, we encounter the most politically turbulent and, frankly, paradoxical part of his life.
It really is.
Pavlov lived and conducted his key research during a period of massive political upheaval in Russia. He's straddling the end of the Tsarist era, the revolution, and the dawn of the Soviet regime.
It creates a cognitive dissonance that's really hard to reconcile. Despite his work being rooted in Tsarist Russia, he continued his work for decades under the Soviet regime, directing the Department of Physiology at the Institute of Experimental Medicine for a staggering 45 years.
And the paradox is that he was simultaneously a political thorn in the side of the regime and their international scientific showpiece.
He was highly regarded by the Soviet government, praised by Vladimir Lenin herself, and he received significant money, support, and honors for his laboratory,
which almost guaranteed his survival and continued ability to do research.
The initial Soviet interest was both pragmatic and ideological. Lenin and the Bolsheviks saw Pavlov's work on conditioned reflexes as the scientific validation for creating Homo Sovieticus, the new Soviet man.
A being whose behavior could be engineered through environmental conditioning?
Exactly. They poured tremendous resources into his work to prove the scientific superiority of the Marxist-Leninist state.
So the state essentially funded his scientific fortress. But this financial support did not buy his political silence or his approval?
No, it did not.
Which is astonishing considering the increasing repression under Stalin.
It's incredible. Pavlov openly and consistently concealed his disapproval and outright contempt for Soviet communism. He was remarkably vocal about his opposition, a stance that was incredibly dangerous at the time.
Especially in the 1920s and 30s, when intellectuals and scientists who expressed dissent were routinely purged, imprisoned, or executed.
So what are the best examples of his open contempt and protest where he really risked everything?
There are several powerful statements that you have to put into context. The Communist Party saw itself as conducting this grand, necessary social experiment.
And in 1923, Pavlov publicly stated that he would not sacrifice even the hind leg of a frog to the type of social experiment that the communist regime was conducting in Russia.
That is a direct slap in the face. He's comparing his meticulously controlled, ethical scientific work to the Bolshevik Revolution and finding the revolution to be less valuable than a frog's limb.
That level of dissent was suicidal for almost anyone else, and he escalated the criticism as the repression deepened.
In 1927, amidst forced collectivization and the increasing crackdown on non-party members, he wrote a direct letter to Joseph Stalin.
To Stalin himself, protesting the harsh treatment of Russian intellectuals and stating with remarkable candor that he was ashamed to be a Russian.
How did that letter not result in his immediate disappearance?
Again, it speaks to the global symbolic value of Pavlov. He was the only Russian Nobel laureate, and his work was deemed essential propaganda. The Soviets made a calculated, pragmatic decision that the benefit of having him as a symbol of Soviet science, even a critical one, outweighed the cost of silencing him,
So they just showered him with funding and built him world-class facilities.
effectively granting him special immunity.
And did he try to use his prestige to protect his colleagues?
Yes, this is perhaps his most heroic political act. After the murder of Sergei Kirov in 1934, which was used as the pretext to unleash the massive purges of the late 1930s,
Yeah.
Pavlov wrote several impassioned letters to Vyacheslav Molotov, one of Stalin's key lieutenants, criticizing those mass persecutions and asking specifically for the reconsideration of cases involving people he knew personally.
So he wasn't just safe in his laboratory. He was actively leveraging his position to intervene in the state terror machine.
He was. It was a perilous, brave, and extremely rare use of scientific prestige to try and inject some humanity into a brutal system.
It seems, though, that his attitude softened slightly in his final years. Was this just resignation, or did he genuinely see some positive changes?
It was a nuanced shift. It seemed born out of appreciation for the state's massive investment in his field, rather than ideological alignment.
So while never endorsing the politics, he did publicly praise the Soviet government for its vigorous financial and infrastructural support of scientific institutions.
He specifically noted the stark contrast between the facilities he had then and the cramped, underfunded conditions he worked in during the Tsarist era.
And he seems to have held a flicker of hope right until the end.
A few months before his death, he expressed pleasure at the draft of the 1936 Stalin Constitution. He saw the language of rights and freedoms, however illusory they were in practice, as the apparent dawn of a more free and democratic Soviet Union.
A move toward political liberalization that tragically never materialized before he died in 1936.
And outside of his politics and his lab, his personal life was marked by incredible hardship, too.
That's right. The famous scientist started out very poor.
He did. Pavlov, despite growing up in a priestly household, was an atheist. He said he became an unbeliever and atheist in my school years while he was still a seminarian.
And his marriage in 1881 to Serafima Vasilyevna Karchavskaya, who he called Sarah, was marked by 9 years of extreme poverty.
They often had to live apart or stay with others, relying on Sarah's small teaching salary, while Pavlov struggled to secure a permanent research position. Sarah was really his indispensable emotional and financial backbone during those early, difficult years.
And they faced immense personal tragedy as well.
Yes, Sarah's first pregnancy ended in a miscarriage, and while they eventually had 4 surviving children, they suffered the tragic loss of their first son, Murchik, in childhood, which caused Sarah deep and lasting depression.
And their youngest surviving son, Vsevolod, also died of pancreatic cancer in 1935, just a year before Pavlov himself. Hardship was just constant for him, even as his fame grew.
And even his final moments were a testament to his ingrained instinct for research.
A scientist until his very last breath.
Absolutely. Pavlov died on February 27, 1936, at age 86 from double pneumonia. He remained conscious until his final moments, and in an astonishing demonstration of his commitment to empirical observation, he asked a student to sit beside his bed and record the subjective circumstances of his dying.
He dictated his symptoms, the progression of his pain, his failing senses, all to create unique, real-time evidence of the terminal phase of life.
So we started this deep dive with the simplistic idea of a bell and a salivating dog, and what we've discovered is a monumentally complex man.
A surgical pioneer who won the Nobel for meticulously mapping physiological digestion.
A fierce, open critic of the Soviet government who was simultaneously funded and protected by it.
And a researcher whose accidental observation just fundamentally changed how we view learning and behavior. His conditional reflex influenced not just the scientific community founding behaviorism, comparative psychology, and modern therapeutic techniques like systematic desensitization,
Right.
but it also infiltrated popular culture.
Right. We see the direct influence of Pavlovian conditioning in works like Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, where babies are conditioned to dislike books and nature.
And in Thomas Pynchon's complex, conditioning-laden narrative in Gravity's Rainbow. His legacy is concrete, too. The Pavlov Institute of Physiology, which he founded in 1925, was named after him following his death.
The philosopher Bertrand Russell once observed that while it's open to question whether Pavlov's methods cover the whole of human behavior, they cover a very large field.
And they showed how to apply scientific methods with quantitative exactitude. It's that exactitude, that dedication to measurable, observable physiological truth that really defined his life.
From the operating table maintaining the vagus nerve to the lecture hall explaining the basis of temperament.
Which brings us back finally to one of his lesser-known but most fascinating concepts, transmarginal inhibition, PMI.
The body's natural circuit breaker, the shutdown response to overwhelming stress.
So if Pavlov's research showed us that our innate temperaments dictate how quickly we reach that critical shutdown point under duress, consider this final thought.
How might modern digital information overload, the constant high-intensity 247 stream of data, stimulation, and manufactured urgency, creating universal chronic conditions that push all of us, regardless of our underlying temperament, closer and closer to that critical threshold of nervous system collapse?
The very environment we inhabit today might be forcing a systemic TMI response in an effort to cope, making Pavlov's forgotten concept more relevant now than ever before.